Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Xizhen, and on behalf of the lecture committee, I would like to welcome you all to today's talk in our Spring 2025 faculty lecture series. This is our last talk of this year. So before I introduce this week's speaker, Joe, I would like to say a few words about how the faculty lecture series was started initially for any first-time attendees. So the faculty lecture series was founded in 1911 by Catherine Merotti Pratt, the spouse of a faculty member who wanted to, quote, relieve the tedium of long New England winters with an opportunity to hear Williams professors talk about issues that really matters to them, unquote. So from these humble and lighthearted beginnings, the faculty lecture series has grown to become an important forum for tenured professors to share their latest research with a larger intellectual community of the college. So today, we'll be hearing from Professor Joe Lee. Joe is an associate professor of anthropology in the Anthropology and Sociology department at Williams. He received his PhD from Columbia University in 2015. His research focused on caste and its entanglement with religion, labor, environment, secrecy, and sensorium in South Asia. He is the author of the book, Deceptive Majority, Dalit, Hinduism, and Underground Religion, published by Cambridge University Press 2021. And he's also the co-author of the book, Concealing Caste, Passing and Personhood in Dalit Literature, published in Oxford University Press in 2023. Please join me welcoming Joe.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. My deep thanks to the lecture committee for inviting me to share some of my research, and my thanks to each of you today for being here on an afternoon where you have other ways to relieve the tedium. The title of my talk today is on the art of caste concealment. This is something of a deliberate deception. I was hoping to trick art and art history professors my colleagues into coming to a talk that has nothing to do with their field of study. But I'm glad that you are here. Overt displays of caste contempt are not usually a laughing matter. I was perplexed then when my friend Anand Kumar, upon telling me a story of casteist treatment that he had faced, began to laugh. Anand is about 10 years my senior. He runs a non-governmental organization in rural North India dedicated to the empowerment through education of the Dalit community, Dalit meaning oppressed or ground down from a Sanskrit root, and being a term of self-designation for those otherwise referred to as untouchable. That is, a fifth of India's population that is disproportionately subject to stigma, structural disadvantage, and violence. The story Anand was telling me was about the time when his organization first attracted outside funding from the Ford Foundation, as it happens, and purchased a Jeep in which the program workers could travel between the far-flung villages in which they were working. Jeeps were quite rare in the region at the time, and for some dominant caste men, the fact that Anand Kumar, who was well known as belonging to the Dalit caste known as Chamar, was driving such a high prestige vehicle chafed, right? It troubled them. When he would park the Jeep in the nearby town of Husainabad, Anand said, "Ve log chai peekar meri gadi par phenk dete cooler. Meri gadi par phenk dete ki Chamar ki gadi hai ye." People would throw their clay cups, their chai cups, at the Jeep. They would throw the cups at the Jeep, saying, "Look, the Chamar has a Jeep." This is when Anand began to laugh. I did not understand what was funny. So he explained. Anand has a cousin who grew up in another district and who, as Anand puts it, looks like and carries himself like a bunniya. A bunniya is a member of a cluster of relatively high-ranking castes associated with shopkeeping and commerce, trade. This cousin had moved to Husainabad, where he was largely unknown, and had established a small business selling hot fried pakoras along with chai. Because the chai stall was opposite a bus stand on a long-distance route, most of its customers were out-of-towners just passing through and lacked the kind of local networks of knowledge that would enable them to identify the caste of the chai stall owner. But even many locals did not know that he was a chamar and assumed, based on his comportment and status as a shopkeeper, that he was Baniya. Indeed, and this is the source of Anand's laughter, one of the instances that Anand recalls of dominant caste men throwing chai cups at his jeep had transpired at this very chai stall. It was his cousin's chai that these men, entirely unaware, had just willingly taken into their putatively high caste bodies. Isliye hansi aayi, Anand continued. This is why I laughed. Look, our man is cooking and feeding them, and they're eating and drinking with no trouble at all. But the moment they realize that this is a chamar's shop, hansi meri swabhavik hai कि मैं उनकी छाती पर चलता हूँ. My laughter is natural. I am walking on their chests. Anand's narrative raises a host of questions. First, what does it mean to be walking on their chests? The pleasure that Anand derives from the situation seems to be tied up in the anticipation of this moment that these advantaged caste men realize that this is a chamar's shop. But what if they never find out? What implications does unrecognized categorical subversion hold for the caste order? Alternatively, what if they do find out? What happens to the cousin when the dominant caste men discover that they have unwittingly violated their own caste taboos at his hands? What are the stakes of a Dalit being mistaken for or letting himself be mistaken for a Baniya or other high-status castes? Anand's story and other narratives shared with me by friends and acquaintances in North India eventually led me to take up research on what, following what my interlocutors call it, we could call Jat Chupake Rehna, or living with caste concealed. That's the sort of everyday vernacular Hindi-Urdu way of saying it. The research has taken two forms, one literary and one ethnographic. The literary project is a volume that my collaborator K. Satyanarayana, professor of literature at Hyderabad EFL University, and I put together, and that just came out a little over a year ago, which you kindly mentioned. It's entitled Concealing Caste, Passing in Personhood in Dalit Literature, which has the same image. This is a collection of short stories and autobiographical essays by Dalit authors writing in Malayalam and Bengali and Marathi and Hindi and Telugu and Tamil and English, just a few of India's 23 official languages, on the theme of caste concealment. That is, the Dalit protagonists at the heart of these stories and autobiographical writings adopt, in various circumstances and with varying degrees of commitment, a non-Dalit, often privileged caste name and persona as a means of contending with the structural violence of untouchability. Satya and I were struck by the prevalence of this theme in Dalit literary movements, north and south, east and west, in different parts of India, and thought it would be valuable to translate such stories where they've not already been translated, and many of them have not, assemble them all in one place and see what such narratives might collectively tell us. The cover art is by Siddesh Gautam, a wonderful anti-caste artist who can be found on Instagram at Bakery Prasad. That's his sort of artist name, Bakery Prasad. As the subtitle suggests, we also put these stories and essays into conversation with the rich primary and secondary literature on racial passing in the US context. There's a long and generative history of dialogue and conceptual borrowing between critics of racial hierarchy in the US and critics of caste hierarchy in South Asia. Williams College's own Allison Davis, of course, played a key role in this when he and his collaborators analyzed Mississippi social structure as a caste system in 1930s Natchez, Mississippi, in their landmark 1940 ethnography, Deep South. And Isabel Wilkerson's recent book, of course, revives this tradition. But until now, the affinity of racial passing with caste concealment has gone all but unnoticed, and it's one of our aims in this volume to encourage people to read, for example, Nella Larson alongside Om Prakash Valmiki, or Langston Hughes alongside Baburao Bagul, to kind of pair literary figures in these two contexts who have essayed the topic in one way or another. As with passing literature, caste concealment stories probe a notoriously resilient hierarchy from the intimate angle afforded by its surreptitious subversion. They reveal the operations by which things like whiteness and Brahmanhood and other naturalized categories are socially produced, throwing into relief the ensemble of performances by which caste and racial privilege are claimed and sustained. The idea in this book is not, of course, to collapse important vital distinctions between caste and race, nor is our object to kind of impose passing as a paradigm onto phenomena in India that really need to be understood on their own terms. Rather, what we hope is to make available in English the discussions of caste concealment that are already happening in various ways in India's various vernaculars, how these practices are understood in their own contexts, and thus to create conditions for a substantive rather than superficial comparative discussion. The second form that this research has taken is ethnographic. So over the years, since I began doing research in North India, a number of friends and acquaintances revealed to me that they conceal caste in one or another sphere of life. And sometimes it's people telling me about themselves, other times like Anand Kumar, it's his cousin, right, or the uncle, or there are various ways. So these conversations have started, and these friends and acquaintances have introduced me to others who share their situation, and those others have introduced me to still others. So the book I'm working on now, and from which I want to share some material today, follows the careers of Dalits in urban North India who have narrated to me their experiences of clandestinely crossing the touchability line, and the insights afforded by their inhabiting two distinct locations in the social order at once. Their insights tell us a lot about how caste in the contemporary city works, and it's important to recall, of course, that caste shapes the lives of a fifth of humanity. And they also throw light more broadly on communicative operations, the process of semiosis, or the fabrication and interpretation of signs by which we all make ourselves legible to one another. So in the course of this research, I've talked with domestic workers, cops, university students, software engineers, Hindu and Muslim devotional musicians, directors and actors in the Hindi film industry, bureaucrats, professors, journalists, and airplane pilots, all of whom have navigated this risky bifurcation of life into segregated spheres. One might ask how widespread a phenomenon this is, but as a clandestine practice, caste concealment evades the survey and other quantitative instruments of social science. Like other secret and thus probably important domains of human life, this is a story that cannot be told with numbers. Every now and then, a case does erupt into the public sphere, as happened in 2017, when a high-profile meteorologist in the city of Pune filed a case against her domestic cook for allegedly claiming to be Brahmin when she was not, and thus, as Section 419 of the Indian Penal Code has it, quote, cheating by personation. That's the case had several provisions of the Penal Code attached to it, and this was one of them. This was the main one. That case drew attention because caste associations rallied behind both the meteorologist, who is Brahmin, and the cook, who is Maratha, a kind of middle-ranking agrarian caste that is a powerful political force in that region around Pune. Usually, though, caste concealment remains undetected by the only party with an interest in publicly reporting it, so it sort of stays below the radar. The main story I would like to share today comes from interviews with a man I call S.K. Chauhan. This is an alias, though, as will soon be clear, the actual name that it serves to anonymize is itself an alias, adopted by its bearer in two stages of childhood and adulthood for reasons that will become apparent. In this line of research, the use of pseudonyms that has become standard practice for many anthropologists has more than its usual significance. So it's all aliases, and sometimes aliases of aliases from here on out. And one might add that the goal of anonymity is given a strong assist by the fact that the place where I work is the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, which has a population larger than Russia's. My friend Jagdish tells me there is someone I must meet. a recently retired police official who belongs to the Valmiki community. The Valmiki community is the Dalit caste that provides basically all of sanitation labor for North India and Pakistan. So an official who belongs to the Valmiki community, but who, in Jagdish's words, "Jaat chupa ke rehte hain," or lives with caste concealed. The official splits his time between a home in Mathura in western UP, where he was most recently posted, and his new house. And here Jagdish corrects himself, saying it's not just a makan or a house, but rather a koti or a mansion in the capital, Lucknow. It's noon on a scorching day in May when Jagdish and I arrive at the koti, a white 3-story building behind a wall and heavy metal gate embellished with gilding. Engraved on a marble plaque set into the wall are the names of the official and his wife, S.K. Chauhan and Kalpana Chauhan. Such nameplates are the norm in this neighborhood, and the surnames they advertise, Trivedi, Pandey, Pathak, Srivastav, Gupta, Singh, reliably correspond to the titles of North India's advantaged castes. As a well-known Rajput title, and Rajput is among those sort of caste clusters, attached to chief ministers, CEOs, Olympic athletes, and perhaps the most famous sort of Hindu royal dynasty of medieval North India, the Chauhan on our host's nameplate matches the milieu. S.K. Chauhan invites us inside his spacious and immaculate home, and over several hours and rounds of chai, shares with us stories of his life. The circumstances of his childhood contrast starkly with the environment of our interview. Chauhan was born in 1952 in Mahoba, a district in southwestern Uttar Pradesh, notorious for its, quote, backwardness. And I should introduce the term scheduled caste, which is just the governmental term for Dalit, right? It's how the government cognizes this large category. So here's, I'm going to quote Chauhan at length here. Among the scheduled castes, there is one Valmiki caste, he tells us. I was born into the Valmiki caste. My mother and father did sanitation work. Mother and father both. They did cleaning work from house to house. In those days, there was no sewer line. So people had manual cleaning toilets in the house. The access gate was from the outside. So it was use your toilet inside, and from outside they'll come and clean it. So all day people would use their toilets, and my mother and father would go to each one and use an iron scoop and either an iron pot or a small basket. They would put plastic or paper lining inside the basket and fill it up with the contents. They would put ashes on it because the excrement was wet. In those days, we would go and we would collect ashes, and we would cover the feces with the ashes. Then when the basket was full, after 4, 5, 8, 10, 15 houses filling the basket, they put the load on their head and took it away. I too used to do this work sometimes in my childhood to help out mom and dad. Chut itni thi. There was a lot of untouchability. People wouldn't let us inside their homes. They avoided touching us. Am Samaj, the general public, and the term general there is interesting, right? Because it also connects with the category of general caste. The general public, Pandits, Thakurs, Kshatriyas, Baniyas, those people would not touch us. If there was something to give, they would give it from above. Roti, coins, whatever was to be given, my mother would receive it like this. And here Chauhan mimics the act of holding open a dupatta or a scarf to receive gifts dropped from above, a gesture of caste and gender deference. In his childhood, S.K. Chauhan was neither S.K. nor Chauhan. My parents named me. My name at first was not Chauhan, nor was it Shiv Kumar. In those days, our people were given ghalad naam, wrong names, by Brahmins, crooked, ugly names. We could not have good names or names of God. Jagdish, our mutual friend who's sitting there with us, chuckles and interjects some examples. Kalu, Bagadu. Examples of the kinds of names previously bestowed on Dalit children by their parents or by the landlords for whom the parents worked in Uttar Pradesh. Though such names are much less common now, Jagdish has a number of neighbors with the very names that he mentions in the Valmiki neighborhood where he lives. But when I gained admission to school, Chauhan continues, my older brother changed my name. In 6th class, at the beginning, I had been named Bhuka, which is hungry, right? Which is one of the kind of class of names of this sort. Bhuka. It was not good, it was bad. And when you gained admission, I asked, then I became Shiv Kumar, SK. Already Chauhan Saab's narrative features 2 acts of naming. To bestow a name, of course, is to accomplish a performative speech act in the strict Austinian sense of the term. And several of you from class are here. You can explain that for everyone, right? The Austinian sense, to utter words that alter rather than describe the world, not performative in the sense, the very popular sense now of like just performative, just for show, right? But performative, transforming the world through speech, substantively. Now, the illocutionary force of an act of naming, its transformative efficaciousness, rests on a set of felicitous conditions established by convention. Chauhan's parents, as the legitimate agents of the act of naming, do carry out a successful or happy, in Austin's terms, performative when they name him Bhuka, yet clearly their agency in this act is constrained by or indeed shared with the dominant castes among whom they live, who will not countenance elevated names among the Dalits who work for them. If the operations of performative speech acts reveal arrangements of power, it seems that this mid-20th century shift that we see in Chauhan's own story from lordly to parental rights to name Dalit children in rural UP was less of a radical break and more of a partial transition. Chauhan's second naming significantly is accomplished by an intermediary figure, neither his parents nor Chauhan himself, but his brother, his older brother. A child of post-colonial India, the brother comes of age in the inaugural moment of the universal franchise and the constitutional abolition of untouchability, not of caste, but of untouchability, right? Article 17 of the Indian Constitution. Untouchability is abolished. Even as the parent's livelihood continues to derive from excrement removal. And it is an intermediary name that the brother chooses. Shiv Kumar registers as far more dignified than Bhuka or Kalu or Bagaru or any of that class of names, which Susan Benson, an anthropologist, calls injurious names. Yet it remains unassuming. With a kind of modest everyman's feel, Shiv Kumar poses no threat to the privileged caste monopoly on impressive-sounding names. Chauhan Sahib tells us about the government school he attended in Mahoba. School fees were waived on account of his being scheduled caste. He was among the first generation of Dalit children to benefit from independent India's efforts to democratize access to education. Yet inclusion was not on equal terms. Here's another long quote from Chauhan. In school, they didn't let us sit with everyone else. We were seated separately. Sharif log, well-born people, would sit here, so we would be over by the door or out in the back or in the corner. The master, the teacher who taught us, he would do it. He would say, Abbe, you people, you sit over there. Ours was a small town, so everybody knew everybody else's caste. Everyone knew who my parents were. My parents actually worked at the home of some of my class fellows. Those classmates did not let me sit near them. But there were some people who did not practice untouchability. There were, for instance, two or three Christian and Muslim families. They were friends who would sit with me, and they even had me over to their homes. I kept studying. Then in 8th class, I came in first in the entire school. That is, he earned the highest score in a competitive all-school examination, thus making him a topper, the category of the topper. When my mom went to work, a boy at the house she was cleaning said to his mom, Mom, the son of the Jamadarni came first in the class. The reported remark of the boy at his mother's workplace tracks a shift in the signs by which the young Shiv Kumar is recognized by his peers, right? From son of the Jamadarni to first in the class. Caste does not disappear in this formulation, nor does it simply yield to the meritocratic principle. Rather, the conjoining of a sign of superior aptitude, a top in the class, with an object presumed to congenitally lack it, endows the situation with a kind of frisson. Shiv Kumar becomes a novelty, a figure who no longer elicits only caste contempt, but also a kind of fascination now, an attraction. SK took up in this period in high school and then into college wrestling and other sports, and we could talk about the complexities of wrestling in the context of caste. After completing his bachelor's, he applied to join the Uttar Pradesh police, furnishing certificates of academic and athletic achievement, as well as his caste certificate, which testifies to his status as a member of a scheduled caste. He interviewed for and obtained a posting as sub-inspector of police, also known as SP, or also by the old Persian title Daroga. Daroga Saab. So he trained at Moradabad, that's the UP Training Center for Police, learning to use firearms and ride horses, and took his first posting at Meerut in western UP. I asked him if this is where he began to use the title Chauhan, right? Because so far Chauhan hasn't come in the narrative. SK replies by describing the effects of making use of Chauhan in verbal interactions. Chauhan to aisa hai ki aaj bhi kahin jaiye, kisi se parichay karaiye. Chauhan is like this. Even today, go anywhere, introduce yourself to someone, whether in a train, a bus, in some function, in some cultural program, in some community event, in some festival, you meet someone. If you say your name, Shiv Kumar, then that one will ask, what comes before or after Shiv Kumar? First question. After that, their mentality changes. If you're Chauhan, they'll take proper care of you. He's general caste. I'll do the needful. If you're scheduled caste, then they'll become anti, as in the English prefix anti. तो इससे बचने के लिए हम कभी-कभी चौहान लिख देते हैं, जिससे कोई आगे पीछे न पूछे. So to avoid this, I sometimes give my name as Chauhan, so that no one asks what comes before or after, so that I can avoid, and here he uses this word dunk, so I can avoid the sting of casteism. Sting. To clarify, I ask SK when he began to deploy the Chauhan title. In the police, as in many other spheres of government employment, there's very little scope for concealing one's caste, especially in the lower ranks, because it's in your paperwork, right? It's in your likapurdi. As the saying goes, your caste arrives at the office before you do. Everyone knows. So I wondered, as my friend Jagdish did, in what social context this method of avoiding the sting of casteism first presented itself. The context, it turns out, and this is the case with so many of the people I've talked with in this project, was housing, finding a place to rent. Due to a not uncommon shortage of accommodation in police quarters on his second posting, SK was compelled to look for housing on the open market. Hamara transfer Allahabad mein hua, jahan chua-chut bahut hai kam mein. I was transferred to Allahabad, where I saw a lot of untouchability. People wouldn't rent out. So I said, I won't tell anyone. So there I said my name was Chauhan and I got a house. I had tried a lot. Wherever I went, they asked my caste. I had these batchmates who were Chamars. They said, Yaar, no one rents to a scheduled caste here. If you're going to live here, then live in another scheduled caste locality. So, after I wasn't able to get a flat, I told the next landlord I was Chauhan and I got the flat. I never brought people from work to the flat. I warned the police station people, don't tell my caste. I had my children to educate. They were in school. I asked Chauhan Saab about the landlord, this first landlord. The landlord, he said, was a Goswami, a Pandit. That's why I said Chauhan, because Chauhan is a Rajput title and this fellow's a Brahmin, so there's already automatically a sort of a respectable distance. I kept my distance from him, never got close. If I had, then he would have sat me down and started asking questions. So it was just namaste, then with a gesture of like quick departure. After his experience with the Allahabad landlord, SK began to adopt the Chauhan title whenever he needed accommodation. You know, as police in UP get transferred a lot. It's a recent study of this. It's a very high frequency moves. So he's been posted in many districts in his career. Where finding a landlord who would accept him was impossible before by his account, it was now simple. He told me about another landlord who, he only found out on the phone when he had his interview with him, was himself Chauhan. When SK introduced himself as Chauhan, the landlord asked him which kind of Chauhan. To which SK replied with the highest Chauhan Gotra, that is a kind of exogamous patriline or subgroup within the caste, that he knew. Impressed, the landlord said, "Theek, theek, baradar ke aadmi rahiye." Good, caste fellow, you can have the place, it's yours to rent. By this time, SK had shifted into the Criminal Investigation Department, or the CID. This was salutary, he told me, for the purposes of keeping the landlord from asking too many questions. I said to the landlord, I'm in the CID department. We do clandestine operations. I can't keep close contact with people, including you. Kindly don't involve yourself in my business. We would wear disguises, he added. a different disguise for here and a different one for there. I asked Chauhan Sahib if the irony of this situation ever gave him occasion to laugh. "Bahut zyada dukh hota tha, phir bhi hansi aati thi." I was deeply sad, even so, yes, I would laugh at it sometimes. And it was dangerous too. There was fear in the mind. I mean, my mind would be agitated. Why are you doing this? But what to do? In life, we had the children to raise. We had so much we wanted to do. Though plagued with misgivings, Chauhan Sahib was simultaneously relieved to find a sphere of sociality in which he was reflexively accorded respect. SK began to use the Chauhan title not just with landlords, but beach mein, here and there, on this occasion and that, on the train, on the bus, in the market. As SK's rank within the police hierarchy ascended, and I'm summarizing, the chapter goes on in much more detail, his Chauhan title seemed increasingly fitting. Members of the public expected a high-ranking police officer to have a name like Chauhan. It's sort of appropriate. There's an elective affinity. By 2011, SK had risen in the ranks to Deputy Superintendent of Police, or DSP. It was an election year when the Election Commission assumes, as a federal commission, the Election Commission assumes extraordinary powers, including that of reassigning police in poll-bound districts in the interests of ensuring the electorate's free and fair exercise of the franchise. And it's often kind of a sweep of any high-level police who've been accused of corruption. So that's what happened. Under these circumstances, SK was transferred as DSP, as the highest position you can have in the district, into a district in which he had never previously been posted and in which he was unknown. Moreover, as an appointee of the Election Commission, he arrived with extraordinary grounds of authority that prevented his junior officers from scrutinizing his paper trail. So here, SK began to use Chauhan routinely in his interactions with the public, with local media seeking information about investigations, and with subordinate members of his staff. This went well, he said, for about 6 months. Everyone called me Chauhan Sahib, Chauhan Sahib. And Sahib is a respectful title that kind of is attracted to titles like Chauhan. So Chauhan Sahib, it's doubly respectful. Chauhan Sahib, Chauhan Sahib. Then there was this inspector who was transferred to our department from Agra. He knew me from before. He too was scheduled caste. He told everyone, "This is our man, he's our man." He said it in the office, with the staff, with everyone, with the public, with the press reporters. The press people used to come every day for the crime report. What murders, what robberies, what had happened. They needed news to print, so they all started to say, they found out that it's like this. Here Chauhan Sahib's speech drops to a fragmented whisper, and after a long pause, he resumes. The people who used to socialize with us started keeping distance. Those who favored me became anti. The people in my staff who used to give me respect, my guard, my driver, my gunner, my helper, who used to carry around all my bags, who used to carry around my diary for me, they all stopped. They used to help, they stopped. A lot of people stopped coming to our house. Our cook at home, as a DSP, you get allotted a cook. He stopped coming. He said, "Sir, I'm not going to work at your place." I asked Chauhan how long he continued to live there after the exposure. 3 years, he said. Jailte rahe chup chap. We suffered it quietly, quietly. Later in our conversation, Chauhan Sahib tells me that his caste is known for 3 things: safai, sur, sharab. Sweeping, swine, and alcohol. These are the chop of our caste. You've heard this word chop? And he said it just like that. He chop, shabd suna hai? So kind of metalinguistic pointing at the word chop. Yes, I say chop, stamp, impression, also a poet's signature. And Jagdish, our friend who's sitting with us, chimes in with another synonym, mohar, he says. That is an impression on wax, like a seal. Chauhan Sahib continues. Indication, he says, using the English word, and then switching back to Hindi. If someone says bhangi, and this is another term for the same caste, but a little more pejorative and less polite than Valmiki. So if someone says bhangi, then a person's brain will go to this place, those eaters of swine, those sweepers, those drinkers of liquor. That is what is pressed on the mind. That is the indication. Because in our caste, most people have adopted these things. True, says Jagdish, 80% plus. So the formulation by which Chauhan Sahib describes what happens when someone utters the word bhangi converges quite strikingly with the theory of signification advanced by philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. Chauhan's account features the same triadic structure as Peirce's, in which a sign represents an object that excites in the mind of the hearer a more developed sign or an interpretant, making semiosis a dynamic process rather than the reproduction of a static signifier-signified binary. Moreover, Chauhan Sahib characterizes the chop, the stamp of caste, as an indication, or in other words, an index. In Peirce's well-known typology of signs, the index is a sign that represents its object on the ground of contiguity or physical connection at a moment in time or space. Thus, smoke indexes fire, and an act of pointing indicates the object pointed at. These contrast with icons, which represent their object on the grounds of likeness or similarity, as a statue does what it represents, and with symbols, which represent their objects on the grounds of social convention, as a national flag or a word. How does the uttering of a caste epithet make a person's brain go to this place, those eaters of swine, those sweepers, those drinkers of liquor? One way in which the chop operates indexically is hinted at in Chauhan's statement, because in our caste most people have adopted these things. That is to take the first of Chauhan's triad, safai, cleaning, sanitation, due to an actually existing caste-based division of labor, and perhaps in particular the extraordinary visibility of municipal sanitation workers in public space, the hearer of the epithet has likely encountered people of this caste in specific places and identifiable moments of time wielding the broom. Thus, an indexical link is formed between the category of person and the form of labor in the mind of each participant in everyday life, and this link is then subsequently activated every time one hears the caste title. This would be in keeping with sort of well-established understandings of how social indexicality works. But there is another way in which the chop is pressed upon the brain in Chauhan's account. There's a feature of police work to which Chauhan Sahib several times makes reference in our conversation. It seems to haunt him. It kind of comes up repeatedly and often without connection to the previous statement. Thane mein jab pitai hoti thi, na. Whenever there was a beating in the police station, they would say, "I'm going to beat you until you're a bhangi." I've heard this my entire life. Looking like a bhangi, dressed like a bhangi, thief, chamar, bhangi. When a pundit or a thakur would be caught stealing something, he would say, "I'm not a chor chamar, I'm a pundit." Or, "I'm not a chor chamar, I'm a thakur." Okay, so the policemen, who are pundits and thakurs, the darogas, the constables, as they're beating the suspects, giving them the third degree, they would say, "I'm going to beat you so much you're a bhangi. You've come here making a face like a bhangi," as though ugly, meaning that ugly faces are the special preserve of bhangis. And I would listen to this, sitting there, because I had my duty to do. The knife cut on top of the heart. They were abusing someone else, but the abuse also struck me. I was the bhangi. There's much more in this account than we can, do justice to in our short time together. But for the purposes of the analysis being developed, if we attend to Chauhan Sahib's consistent treatment of chop and indication as synonyms, his concomitant usage of dabna or dabjana, which is to press down, apply pressure, exercise authority, and his recourse to a scene of verbal and physical assault to explain how caste epithets operate, we're presented with a vivid semiotic account of how caste is worked into the person. Or to restate it in the terms of Francis Bacon's old definition of power, how a new nature is generated or superinduced on a given body. In the police station, the association between people and of a particular caste and the qualities of criminality, ugliness, subjugated status, and devalued speech practices is pressed simultaneously into the flesh, into the minds of the recipients of this violent speech act. The indexical link thus forged is lodged in the embodied memory of everyone present, stamped upon the brain and body of the interrogated, the interrogators, and the bystanding Chauhan Sahib, albeit with disparate effects. The implications of Chauhan Sahib's identification of caste attributes as chop, we might say, are considerable. An index is not an essence. Stamping is done from the outside, not the inside, and it requires force. It must be recalled how at variance this conception is from popular and prevailing understandings of caste in the social environment in which Chauhan Sahib lives. In Uttar Pradesh, in the context of opposition to intercaste marriage, one routinely hears aphorisms of this genre. I mean, there are many variations on this. Does a fish climb trees? Do lions mate with sheep? Does a crow give birth to a swan? These and innumerable others reflect an understanding of caste, and the local word is jati, which is cognate with genus in Latin. These and innumerable others reflect an understanding of caste as natural kind and caste attributes as inborn traits. A not surprising view, given that the term jati denotes not only endogamous social groups, castes, but also precisely species in the Linnaean classificatory schema, right? So in Hindi science textbooks, you read about this jati of fish and that jati of fish, right? The distinction between jati qua species and jati qua caste is of course acknowledged, but that does not mean that the species paradigm plays no role in animating social thought. Ajanta Subramanian, in her excellent recent ethnography, points out that a weaker notion of biological difference, of caste not exactly as species, but as genetic inheritance of merit or meritlessness in the blood, as it were, enjoys currency not only in places like, urban UP, but in elite institutions such as the Indian Institutes of Technology and in Silicon Valley. Another salient view in UP is the ontology of untouchability that Gandhi sketches in his ruminations on the category of the Bungi. He wrote voluminously on this category of the Bungi. The Bungi was, if you look at his 100-volume collected works, it's got one of the largest, in the index, Bungi has one of the largest entries. It's quite astonishing. Loomed large in his thought. For Gandhi, the right-minded doing of sanitation labor constituted Bungi being, a valorized condition insofar as it serves humanity by providing a salubrious environment. Gandhi's assertion of his capacity to represent the sanitation labor castes, to actually be a Bungi, as he often insisted that he was, rested on his voluntary performance of this labor, and his disqualifying of some members of this caste from representing their caste fellows rested on their not doing it. In this schema, sanitation work is a sacred duty of the ideal Bungi. That's from his essay called The Ideal Bungi from 1936. This view, while in some ways very distinctive to Gandhi, is in other ways very much alive and well today, and it is on display in several features of the advertisement and implementation of this national campaign, the Swachh Bharat or Clean India campaign, supported by the Narendra Modi administration, the present administration. But unlike the natural expression of inborn traits or genetic inheritance, or the fruit of the cultivation of noble intention in sanitation work, chop does not emerge from within, but is imposed from without. In Chauhan Sahib's model, caste attributes are not inherited or inwardly developed, but impressed upon the mind by external force in the manner of a wax seal, a textile print, a numismatic image, striking coins, that's another form of chop, or a sectarian forehead marking, all instantiations, all various applications of the word chop. Yet there's more. As poetic signature, another meaning of chop that's relevant here, as poetic signature, or as anguta chop, that is the thumbprint by which sanitation workers and other workers who don't happen to have literacy mark their presence in daily work logs, the chop is also an authenticating mark, a sign witnessing the presence or authorship of a specific person. Who was this person present at that day, right? Did this poet write that poem? It's in their chop, which is the appearance of their name in the final verse of the poem. That's a chop. So this is another paradigmatic index in the Persian system. But chop can also mean copy or duplicate. And as is suggested by the history of the substitution of one composer's chop for another in actual oral performance of poetry, and the substitution of one laborer's thumbprint to cover for another who's not well, right? If your friend is not able to come to work that day, you might give your thumbprint to cover for them so their pay isn't docked. And nobody's looking that closely so they're essentially isomorphic, right? What is imagined and represented as the authenticating signature may be rather the duplicate or the imitation. The title Chauhan is such a chop, an index of Rajput status, yet subject to duplication. Chauhan Sahib thus offers us an imminent critique of caste that runs athwart popular conceptions and develops elements of semiotic theory latent in the North Indian vernacular. Chop enlarges the arsenal of anti-caste thought. And I would submit, moreover, that his key concept of the chop presents an improvement over its Persian analog that gets a lot of play in sort of Anglophone social theory. The chop does the conceptual work of the index, right? A sign that represents its object based on actual physical connection. It's every bit as illustrative of signification anchored in physical connection as the index finger is, but the chop is more attuned than is the index to relations of force, to vulnerability to counterfeit, and to actual human habits of social recognition. So I think this actually can improve enrich our semiotic vocabulary. Chauhan Sahib is now retired. He and his wife stay with each of their children in rotation. Their children live in various towns in UP, shifting every couple of months between their homes in different parts of the state. In retirement, he's begun to participate more in Valmiki community events and social issues. This is, in fact, how he and Jagdish met. Using his police connections, Chauhan recently helped an activist friend of Jagdish's by arranging the release of some Valmiki students who had been jailed in connection with a fight between privileged caste and Dalit student groups. Though not identified as Rajput in police work after that terrible exposure, Chauhan's social life remains bifurcated. Family, former colleagues, and some friends know him as Dalit. Others, all of his neighbors, and most of his acquaintances in his reckoning, know him as Rajput, and new acquaintances make the same assumption. As he puts it, from my nature, behavior, knowledge, lifestyle, environment, the way I treat people, people think he must be general caste. General caste here means advantaged caste, everyone but Dalit and the other major governmental category of backward caste. Again, we see caste membership inferred from a bundle of indexes or indices, behaviors, manners, accoutrements. The chop of Dalithood that marked Chauhan's childhood, sweeping swine, alcohol, poverty, a name like Bhikhari, have been meticulously avoided or effaced. Surfaces once stamped with the signet of untouchability are now smooth, or they now feature a new set of impressions, the chop of the Rajput. So let me end with what is really just the beginning of the next chapter, generationally speaking, and which raises a totally new set of questions. The front door opens and in strides a young man in sportswear. Chauhan Sahib introduces his son, Sandeep, who works for a national automotive manufacturing company and has just returned from an employee's cricket match. The trophies in the case against the wall where we're sitting and having this chat, cricket trophies, tennis, track and field, they belong to Sandeep. After greetings and small talk, Sandeep proceeds to the interior of the house. His father turns back to us and says, both of our sons write Chauhan. We gave them the Chauhan surname. We gave it to our daughter as well. When it came time to raise the children, Chauhan tells us, he and his wife discussed the matter and agreed to use the surname Chauhan, not just in everyday life, not just in introducing people, but on the birth certificate and on government papers. She was pleased with this, he says. And here I'll end with a quote from Chauhan. We wrote all of their names as Chauhan. We did this from their first class of school, and we kept them in the general caste. On the ration card, it is written general caste. On the ID card, the I card, on the Aadhaar card, on all the cards. We didn't have a scheduled caste certificate made. There is a scheduled caste scholarship in school, in government service. We did not take it. Fees are waived. We did not take the fee waiver. This was because the sting of being a scheduled caste, so that this sting would not affect the nature of our children. Wo robe se rehte hain. They live in prestige. Thanks. Would love to hear your questions, remarks, thoughts. Yes, Shanti. Thanks for coming.
I know you're focused, at least in what you're presenting here today, on the semiotic, on the naming, the performativity of naming. What I'm wondering about in what was said in this lively conversation about all of the other performative signifiers of caste, of clothing, language that's used, foods that are eaten, holidays that are celebrated or not celebrated, all of those other things which I assume they would also have to fashion to meet the Chauhan surname. Or was there a disconnect between these things?
Yeah, great, thanks so much. Yes, and you've suffered through another chapter of this, which thank you for that again. The protagonist of the adjacent chapter, Rimpi, who is a domestic worker, captures that very nicely. She kind of throws out this trilogy of boli, kapde, pechan, clothes, speech, and sort of like broadly signs by which we're recognized. You have to change all of that, she says, in order to get a job as non-Dalit. I mean, it's on the basis of being non-Dalit. Yeah, I mean, it's true, different people emphasize different sort of aspects, and the question of food and cooking in the neighborhood doesn't come up in his. It's interesting, Shanti, you ask, because gender segregation in everyday life, it tends to be like in certain social classes and not others, and so with people like Rimpi who live in a Dalit neighborhood and are only concealing in the context of the workplace, and otherwise the rest of life is kind of with the community. There's total. I mean, there's very little gender segregation in everyday life in the Dalit neighborhood, and so interviews are generally communal, and women and men are all present. But in like Chauhan's situation, right, it's very gender segregated, and I've actually never met his wife after like much time that we spent together. So there's that. But yes, with other people in this kind of economic class, the question of what one cooks at home becomes another signifier of, potential signifier of Dalitness. And so there's a kind of, by necessity, one has to become vegetarian, right? And so the kind of Dalit food culture has to be sort of closeted, and that has all kinds of, I mean, that's what you put into your body, right? That's, it has substantial effects. But yes, thanks for raising that. Yes?
That was really fascinating. I just want to ask about the scheduled caste conception, and in particular the government's role in policy around creating these presumably opportunities, intended opportunities for members of the scheduled caste to sort of surmount in an economic way the background they came from. But it sounds like that it's something of a mixed bag. Certainly in this story, he got his life, he got an opportunity as a result of his policy, but yet it was also a problem. So I was hoping you could maybe help me think through the policy angle here?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, the term scheduled caste appears in the 1930s, so late colonial period, and it was first in South India in what was then the Madras Presidency that a system of what we would now call affirmative action was first kind of rolled out, and then it expands to other parts of British India. And then so the schedule, right? The schedule is just the list, and so it's the scheduled castes are the castes that are on the list. So it's a political designation, right? Ultimately, it's the legislature that decides who's on the list and who's not. And of course, there's always some contestation of who should be there and who shouldn't be, but there's also a lot of stability in that category from the 30s onward. One major shift that happens upon independence and the implementation of the Constitution is that there's a kind of religious restriction on it. So it becomes, if you are no person who professes to be a member of a religion other than the Hindu religion shall be deemed to be a member of a scheduled caste, right? So scheduled caste then becomes a kind of category within Hindus, and thus, so Dalit Muslims, Dalit Christians, Dalit Sikhs get excluded from the category, and then a couple of those got back in later on. But more to your point, right, I mean, actually, let me take the occasion to plug a speaker who's coming. Yashika Dutt is coming in the week after spring break. She's written a book called Coming Out as Dalit, a memoir, recent book. She writes about having had to conceal her caste all through childhood, going to these elite boarding schools. Her mother told her, you have to be a Brahmin in this context, right? And so she kind of struggled with that. And then at a certain point she comes out, and she's one of the first people to use that language, apply that language to this context, comes out as Dalit. But a lot of her memoir is about like living with this scheduled caste in kind of urban educated context, especially in the context of elite education. Like the whole caste problem is seen through the lens precisely of scheduled caste status and how many seats are reserved for scheduled caste students in universities, and kind of privileged caste resentment of scheduled castes for taking up those seats. And so that's just a hugely fraught kind of domain, and that sort of kind of overdetermines discussions about castes. Reservations is shorthand for that. So in that, in that debate, there's a lot of it takes kind of predictable meritocracy kind of discourses that are familiar, but every now and then there's a good empirical study of like the kind of effects of scheduled caste inclusion on bringing a certain sector of the Dalit population on economic upward mobility, which seems to have been relatively significant. On the other hand, scheduled caste benefits are, the vast majority of Dalits never actually get to use them. But for those who do, and again, since all these populations are huge, the numbers are significant. I don't know if that answers your question. Peter?
Yeah, my question is sort of maybe rephrasing what Lars just asked. It seems that Chauhan his upward mobility as a policeman is enabling him to pass, and that passing is enabling him to rise up in the hierarchy as well. So it's a kind of mutually determining thing. And I'm wondering if that dynamic is that had he. So I guess it seems like there's in sort of a chicken and egg relationship. And I'm wondering if you or he has a sense of which came first.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Certainly is a mutually determining thing in his case, and of course, the police being a hierarchy in the most official sense, right? A series of ranks. But it does take very particular circumstances for him to sort of go as far as he does with the Chauhan thing, right? It really takes that election commission moment to make this possible in a way that other people, other cops I've talked to, who conceal vis-a-vis the landlord because you sort of have to, but never attempt to do it in the workplace. So yeah, I mean, mutually determining, but also, you know, constraining, especially with government employment. I mean, the government employment really tightens the possibility for concealment, except at the kind of really at the very highest levels. And another of the incidents that first brought me into this was, you know, someone I was interviewing for the first book I was working on. So I was talking with, like, you know, grandchildren of the first generation of children and grandchildren of the first generation of Dalit politicians from independence about their grandparents, right? And so we'd been talking, you know, we were doing sort of oral histories. So one time, one of these people who, you know, had a very high position in a government office in Lucknow. We had previous interviews at his home, but then he invited me to the office, and when he invited me to the office, things were just very strange. You know, about sort of scheduling and so on. And then he invited me in, and then had his peon, that's the official term, you know, serve us chai, and they said, let's not talk about anything. And then after he brought in the chai, he said, now lock the doors. And so he locked the doors, and once the room was locked and everything, then he said, okay, now we can talk about this in this space. And I'd never realized that, but at his office, he conceals. But you know, the question had never arisen at home. But here, you know, he couldn't be sort of overheard talking about his, you know, well-known forebear, who was a Dalit politician. Again, I don't know if I answered your question. Yes, Molly.
I'm really curious where you fit into the story. I mean, just this thing that's concealed is revealed openly. By locking the doors, it's safe, and I'm curious sort of how you think about it, how they think about you. What, you know, is it because you're outside? It's
Yeah, thanks. I mean, sometimes people do say, you know, by virtue of my not having a sort of caste status, some people say, well, you know, it's easy to talk to you because you're not relevant in that sense of things, right? You don't have a place in this particular hierarchy. But then, yeah, I mean, more broadly, like this project only really became possible because people like this official I was just talking about, not Chauhan Saab, but the bureaucrat, it's when he started opening up about his own life and not just his grandfather's, that this kind of became possible. Because of course, it depends on a certain amount of trust and knowing one another for a period of time. So most of the people in the book are people I've known for like a decade. Or who, you know, their close relative introduced me, and so there's sort of chains of accountability. That and like the guarantee of anonymity that matters in this context, right? Like people know, like, okay, well, you're going to write a book, but people want to tell their story, but through a veil of disavowability, which, you know, that's what we're here for, I guess. Yeah, David.
I'm curious about the significance of you raising these kids as general caste.
Mm-hmm.
Does it, in that way, sort of for posterity, you know, giving them general caste, does it make it less Thessalonic then? Is there a religious dimension to this? How does it play into his life story?
Yeah, great. What happens with the next generation is really, really complicated, and there's no quick answer. But it's something that everyone of Chauhan Saab's generation has dealt with in one way or another, and sometimes in very different ways. Like, with another official, for example, his children are teenagers preparing for exams, preparing for college admissions, and we would always have conversations at home when it was just the two of us. And then one time he had me stay for dinner, And so we went out into the park to talk, and then we came back, and then in the park I asked, well, what do you do about the kids? Like, what do they know, and so on. He said, they don't know. And then let's go to dinner, and we had dinner with them, and so it was a very, delicate kind of situation. But yeah, so people have adopted these different approaches. Chauhan Sahib goes on to say that, the push comes to shove when marriage happens, right? When the question of marriage arises, that's the Rubicon, right? You either cross it or you don't, and most people don't, because then the stakes get really high. So there ends up being a kind of, smaller marriage circle within the caste of those who are in this class within the caste, which is a much narrower stratum, but there are enough people to make it. Well, actually what happens is the caste cluster becomes more important than the specific class. So sometimes you have to go outside your caste as such, but you're still within the Dalit category, but outside your own caste, you can find a marriage partner. It's only part of your question. Yes?
So this is super fascinating. I think I've been thinking a lot about mobility and how being able to move around seems like it's a really important part of like creating a blank slate to make that new impression. And I'm just thinking about to whom is that kind of mobility, whether it's geographic or like into a different part of the city to work, as I think one of your examples. To whom is that kind of mobility available? And I'm also wondering whether the internet age, it's kind of shocking that hasn't made that much harder than it seems to be. Like, to just say that this is your name and like have that be your name on your paperwork at work. Like, it seems like that would be really hard to do.
Seems like it'd be harder now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Who has the mobility? Yes, definitely. First of all these stories are urban, right? The Anand Kumar's story about his cousin who runs the chai stall, that's the furthest from urban that you can get, right? If you're in the village, there's no question, everybody knows everybody and there's no hiding anything. But so yeah, right, definitely, urbanization is required. And then within that, right, people who are in a position to especially leave their home city. There was, I guess one could approach this through the story of a journalist who is not Dalit, but from a backward caste that's another official government term, backward caste. So, a touchable but low status caste, whose surname Yadav clearly announces, it's a caste title, it's a straight giveaway. And they're not considered polluting or anything, but they're, the stereotypes are of a rustic kind of farmer type. And not seen as an appropriate person for journalism. And he was a journalist, and he was, doing okay, but really his career was not taking off the way he thought it should have, in Lucknow, which is, a medium-sized city. So he said, all right, I'm gonna move to Delhi and try it there. Still wasn't getting very far in Delhi, and then, in his telling of the story, a Brahmin friend who, he would talk about how this is casteism. People see, my name, Yadav, and they won't give me a job. And his friend said, all right, well, and so he dared him. He said, okay, go into your next interview and say you're Pathak, say you're a Brahmin. It's like, all right, fine. And he did, and then he got the job. And he tells this in a very humorous way as well. But and then he succeeds in journalism for a number of years in Delhi, but the moment he sort of transfers back to Lucknow for family reasons, like to take care of an elder, the game is up, right? Because they're just the networks of people are too dense, and so everything sort of falls apart for him there. Yes.
So stimulating. I learned so much. Thanks, Joel. I have a reading suggestion and then a comment. The reading suggestion is, as you were talking about naming, the importance of naming, and names that make things loftier or names that are supposed to put down, and how even names work as indices of who you are. Gogol's An Overcoat. I don't know if you've read it, but the first paragraph is all about that. And I'm going to reread it now through the lens of caste. It seems like it really lends itself to that. My comment is, I was really interested in how you were doing the semiotic reading of things, but it led me to think about things semantically more, and I don't know if it works within sort of cultural sociolinguistics of you know the context that you're studying, but it almost feels that what is concealed, what wanted to be, was supposed to be concealed, actually becomes elaborated into visibility. I'm thinking of sweeping and cleaning, and the semantics of police as sweepers and cleaners. And it feels like there was something that was hidden, but something that was very much true to who he is, where he came from. And I don't know if linguistically that is allowable, or if I'm thinking about this very much from a sort of English Anglo perspective of the police cleaning the streets.
That's fascinating, Yannicka. Thank you for that. There is a close, so I mean, sweeping and safai does get, it was quite astonishing at first, but the fact that it held, it was remarkable. A political party, in the last 20 years took up the broom, and I mean the broom, there are brooms and there are brooms, right? There's the pool jharu, which everyone can use at home, and that's fine. But the stiff bristled jharu, long-handled, stiff-bristled jharu is not made by any factory anywhere. It's used by, hundreds of thousands of sanitation workers, but they have to make it themselves because it's not a commodity, because no one else would ever buy it or sell it, right? Because it is so profoundly attached to this particular figure who is precisely a caste laborer, right? A Dalit laborer. I mean, the relation between caste and occupation has unraveled for many, many castes, but not for this caste, not at all. So the laga jharu is, anyway, that jharu became the symbol for a political party which was shocking, right? But its whole platform was anti-corruption. It was going to sweep away the corruption. And that held, and it's called the Aam Aadmi Party. So that's remarkable. I mean, there is definitely there's something to explore in the relation between like sweeping and anti-corruption campaigns, and that semantic connection is very much alive. I'll have to think about the police work one. Thanks for that, and the Gogol. Yes.
I was wondering if in India it's common for a election commissioner / deputy supervisor to be able to acquire both a mansion and several other houses. Is that normal for that level, or is there?
Speaking of corruption, I mean, yes, there's a kind of understood. It's sort of understood that a certain amount of cash will exchange hands if you're. I mean, there are always stories of like. I mean, it's an ongoing struggle within the police, as most police would say. There's there are strong pressures to accept bribes, and so that. I mean, Chauhan Saab and I didn't really explore that issue, but. Right. But a fair question, yes. Okay, well, thank you.